The empress who turned her palace into a bizarre orgy. Imagine history's most powerful woman transforming the royal court into a fever dream of secrets and forbidden passion overnight. Ambassadors gossiped, rivals panicked, poets dared to hint but never told all. Why did Catherine rewrite every rule of desire inside Russia's golden halls? The truth might shock you. Let's uncover it. Night fell over St. Petersburg, blanketing the city in ice and shadow. The Neva River glimmered under a thin sheet of ice, reflecting the pale glow of lanterns lining the cobbled streets. The city itself seemed fragile, built on mud, ambition, and dreams that often froze before they could bloom. Inside the royal palace, candles danced in the drafty halls, their flickering light casting shadows on golden walls and crystal chandeliers. Princely guards marched silently, and courtiers whispered behind screens, careful that no one overheard. In the heart of this grand, tense world stood a young woman who no one expected to command an empire. Born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, she arrived in Russia at the tender age of 15, a foreign princess with pale skin, bright eyes, and a mind sharper than most men around her. She came to marry Peter III, a man younger than herself, erratic in behavior, and already unpopular with the nobility. Many in the palace considered her insignificant, a quiet girl who would fade into the background of history. But Sophie, soon Catherine, had a secret weapon: intelligence and ambition far beyond her years. From the moment she arrived, Catherine observed everything. Every frown, every whispered insult, every subtle bow of loyalty became a piece of the puzzle she was building. The Russian court was a chessboard, and she intended to learn all the moves. She learned the language quickly, studied court etiquette, memorized the names and weaknesses of every powerful noble, and watched Peter with careful eyes. The young emperor seemed indifferent, sometimes cruel, sometimes childish, but in his unpredictability, Catherine saw an opportunity. Her marriage was cold, often humiliating. Peter cared more for Prussian ideals and his private obsessions than for his young wife. He ignored her at meals, mocked her in private, and squandered the goodwill of courtiers with careless decisions. Yet Catherine did not despair. She realized that surviving in Russia meant understanding one truth: power is fragile, and desire can be a weapon. By 1762, her careful planning culminated in a bold coup. The army, loyal to Catherine, quietly surrounded Peter's palace. Nobles whispered their allegiance. Guards hesitated. By nightfall, Peter III was removed from power. No blood flowed in the corridors of the palace, but a silent storm of fear and awe swept through the court. Catherine, now Empress of Russia, stood alone at the summit. She was young, surrounded by enemies, and fully aware that one misstep could destroy everything she had built. And yet, Catherine smiled. For she had discovered something few rulers understood. Power alone was not enough. Desire, carefully wielded, could secure loyalty, manipulate rivals, and shape the destiny of an empire. The palace began to change. Candlelit feasts stretched into the night. Masked balls filled the grand halls with music, laughter, and secrets. Select noblemen, generals, poets, and sometimes even foreign ambassadors were invited into Catherine's private world. Each guest understood that nothing in the palace was purely innocent. Every gesture, every glance, every whispered word was loaded with meaning. Rumors spread quickly. The golden amber room became the perfect setting for whispered intrigues. Some stories claimed the room was witness to midnight dances, flirtations, and private encounters that could make or break careers. Others insisted that the tales were exaggerations, that Catherine's cleverness alone inspired fear and fascination. Yet the legends persisted, reaching capitals across Europe. In 1773, a French envoy, Baron de Brou, sent a coded message home. No man rises at court by merit alone. The favor of the empress decides everything. Indeed, Catherine's favorites, like Potemkin, Orlov, and Zubov, rose quickly, drawing envy from older nobility. Nights in the palace became a game of strategy. Music played, candles flickered, and Catherine herself sometimes chose whom to favor or dismiss with nothing more than a look. One English visitor recorded his amazement. In her presence, the highest men became actors in her play. Every gesture, every word seemed orchestrated. One could not tell where pleasure ended and power began. Rumors leapt from palace to city to continent. Diplomats scribbled frantic letters to Paris, Vienna, and London. Courtiers whispered behind velvet curtains, and Catherine, at the center of it all, smiled quietly, knowing the game had only just begun. She understood that loyalty formed in private was stronger than loyalty forced in public. Those who received her attention often gained estates, titles, or even influence over policy. And those who angered her could vanish overnight, leaving only shadows of scandal and warning. Every smile, every invitation, every whispered compliment became a tool. Desire was no indulgence, it was strategy. Outside, St. Petersburg shivered under the snow, streets empty in the cold. But inside the palace, the air was warm with music, laughter, and the quiet hum of plotting. Ambassadors tried to predict Catherine's next move. Poets wrote verses they dared not read aloud. Nobles jockeyed for position, careful never to overstep. And Catherine, young, brilliant, and fearless, orchestrated it all like a master conductor, her ambition and charm shaping the rhythm of an empire. By the end of her first months as empress, it was clear Catherine was no ordinary ruler. She had learned that the heart, desire, and ambition could serve the state as effectively as armies and laws. Her palace became a place where loyalty was tested, fortunes were won and lost, and secrets multiplied like shadows in candlelight. And so the stage was set. The world would watch in awe, fear, and fascination. Behind every gilded door, whispered alliances formed. Behind every mask, ambition and desire danced together. Catherine's court was a place where power and pleasure collided, and where the young empress was determined to master both. Next, we will uncover the men who dared to enter Catherine's secret world, her favorites whose beauty, loyalty, and brilliance helped shape Russia's destiny. Who were the men behind the velvet curtains?
Candlelight flickered through the grand halls of the Winter Palace, casting long shadows on walls gilded with gold and mirrors that reflected the faces of the powerful. Outside, St. Petersburg slept under a thick blanket of snow, but inside, the palace buzzed with whispers, laughter, and the quiet shuffle of secrets. The empress who had taken the throne in a bold coup now ruled not just with laws and armies, but with desire. And she had learned that the men she chose to surround herself with could shape the destiny of Russia. Catherine's court was no ordinary court. It was a world where loyalty, beauty, wit, and ambition collided in candlelit rooms behind heavy velvet curtains. Each man invited into her private circle knew that favor could lift him higher than any title, and that falling out of favor could mean exile, disgrace, or worse. The rules were unspoken but clear. Serve the empress well, and the rewards could be endless. Betray her, and even the grandest estates could not protect you. The first man to capture Catherine's attention was Grigory Orlov, a towering cavalry officer whose loyalty and courage had been crucial during her rise to power. Orlov was not just strong and brave, he possessed charisma that drew attention even in a room full of nobles. He had saved her during the 1762 coup, and for that Catherine rewarded him not just with her trust, but with influence, estates, and access few others could dream of. Orlov's presence at court became a signal to all. The empress's favor was both coveted and dangerous. But Catherine's favorites were not chosen for loyalty alone. Each man brought something unique: charm, intelligence, or political skill. Some, like Orlov, were soldiers and strategists, their courage proving useful beyond the bedroom. Others, like Grigory Potemkin, combined brilliance with ambition, becoming partners in both politics and private life. Potemkin, intense and creative, helped expand Russia's reach to the Black Sea, turning military strategy into an intimate game of trust and influence. In letters, he wrote to Catherine, "You are my friend, my knight, my sovereign." Behind the words of love and friendship lay plans that would shape an empire. Then there were men like the Zub brothers, young, handsome, and cunning. They rose swiftly in Catherine's favor, capturing her attention in the final years of her reign. Eyewitnesses noted how young men across Russia tried to emulate them, seeking the empress's glance like a golden ticket. Yet Catherine's court was also a carousel of ambition and fear. Every favorite knew that another could replace him in an instant, and that the empress's charm could as easily lift as it could destroy. The palace became a place of dames, some innocent, some dangerous. Music played late into the night. Masked balls hid whispered schemes. Courtiers laughed, drank, and flirted, but no one ever forgot that they were being watched. The empress, calm and deliberate, moved among them like a spider in her web. She knew each man's desires, weaknesses, and ambitions, and she used them. Foreign diplomats were fascinated and horrified in equal measure. A French envoy reported, "No man rises by merit alone. The favor of the empress decides everything." Every rumor, every whispered story that reached Paris, London, or Vienna carried a lesson. Catherine's court was a place where power, pleasure, and politics intertwined, and where only the clever could survive. Yet Catherine's use of desire was never reckless. It was deliberate. She chose favorites not only for beauty or charisma, but for loyalty that could be counted on in both private and public matters. They were advisors, generals, and sometimes architects of policy. And in her hands, love and ambition became instruments of statecraft. But were these men truly in love with Catherine? Or were they actors in a game where the stakes were higher than any personal feeling? Orloff's loyalty, Potemkin's ambition, the Zub brothers' cunning, they all knew that favor was fleeting. A smile could elevate them, a glance of displeasure could destroy them. The tension in the palace was constant, a delicate dance of desire, fear, and ambition. Through it all, Catherine's understanding of human nature grew. She knew that every man who entered her private circle carried a risk, but also a reward. Each could become a powerful ally or a dangerous enemy. Her midnight gatherings, rumored across Europe, were as much about shaping the empire as they were about pleasure. Loyalty forged in candlelit halls often lasted longer than laws signed in daylight. And yet the public only saw the rumors. French newspapers printed cartoons mocking the empress. British pamphlets hinted at her midnight feasts. Russian bishops shook their heads, warning of moral decay. Catherine, far from shrinking from scandal, used it as armor. She invited artists to paint her surrounded by her loyal favorites, showing control, confidence, and subtle power. The stories that spread across Europe only heightened her reputation, half fear, half fascination, all influence. By the end of her first decade as empress, Catherine had mastered the rules of her court. Desire was not indulgence, it was strategy. Beauty and charm became tools for loyalty. Midnight gatherings became schools of influence, and every man who stepped behind the velvet curtains knew that the empress's favor could change the course of his life. The stage was set for history. The world watched in awe and horror, unable to decide whether Catherine's court was scandalous, brilliant, or both. And Catherine herself moved confidently through her empire, knowing that every glance, every invitation, and every whispered word had the power to shape Russia's future. Next, we will explore how Catherine's court scandals leapt beyond the palace walls, shocking Europe and testing the limits of her control. When did scandal explode, and how did the empress turn gossip into power?
Spring arrived in St. Petersburg, but the city was far from calm. The Neva River swelled with melted snow, and its dark waters mirrored the clouds that hung low over the city. The streets, still muddy and treacherous from winter, were now crowded with diplomats, merchants, and noblemen, all whispering rumors that had crossed borders and oceans. Every letter carried speculation. Every arrival from abroad brought questions. What was really happening inside Catherine's palace? For decades, stories had swirled about rulers, their lovers, and the hidden intrigues of courts. But Catherine's court was different. It was not just the whisper of forbidden affairs. It was a carefully orchestrated stage where power, ambition, and desire collided, and where the empress herself directed every act. In candlelit rooms, behind heavy velvet curtains, the fate of men, and sometimes entire provinces, hung on a single glance. Foreign ambassadors arrived in St. Petersburg, eager for spectacle. Dressed in silks and furs, their eyes wide with curiosity and suspicion. They had heard tales, masked balls where men and women danced into the early hours, whispers of midnight feasts, the empress's favorites moving through the palace like shadows of influence. French newspapers were full of satire.
British pamphlets hinted at indiscretions. Russian bishops preached warnings of moral decay. Everywhere, Catherine's name carried both fascination and fear. But Catherine was far from shrinking from scandal. She understood it, controlled it, and even used it. Where others saw danger, she saw opportunity. Each rumor, each whispered story that reached Vienna or London fed her legend. Every ambassador who reported tales of indulgence, every poet who dared to hint at her private life, only strengthened her reputation. And Catherine, calm and calculating, smiled quietly behind her fans and screens. Her court was now a theater of influence. Every favorite, every noble, every diplomat entering her private world had a role to play. Some were chosen for loyalty, like Grigory Orlov, whose courage during the 1762 coup had cemented his position. Some were selected for brilliance, like Grigory Potemkin, whose intelligence and ambition made him indispensable as both lover and political strategist. Others, like the young Zub brothers, were alluring, cunning, and willing to risk everything for a glance or a favor from the empress. Orlov, tall and commanding, became both confidant and instrument. His loyalty was unwavering, but he was also human, prone to jealousy, pride, and the dangers that came with proximity to power. Potemkin, in contrast, was like a shadow moving alongside the empress, shaping strategies, suggesting reforms, and negotiating alliances while keeping the heart of Catherine captivated. The palace became a delicate game, a place where intimate moments could shape the fate of armies and borders. The stories that reached Europe were wild. French envoy Baron de Bruy reported, "No man rises at court by merit alone. The empress's favor decides everything. To be seen in her presence is to hold power." Cartoons and pamphlets exaggerated events. Some claimed masked balls were scenes of decadence. Others hinted at secret passages, hidden encounters, and midnight decisions. Rumor painted the court as a place of indulgence, but those who were there knew the truth was subtler and infinitely more dangerous. Catherine's control was extraordinary. She balanced pleasure with politics, affection with authority. Pillow talk could become statecraft. Laughter could become negotiation. Every gesture had meaning. Guests never knew if a whispered compliment was encouragement, a warning, or a test. In this environment, men learned quickly that charm and loyalty were more valuable than courage or title. Catherine rewarded discretion and punished indiscretion. She had learned that desire, used wisely, was as powerful a tool as the army she commanded. The famous masquerade of 1789 became the pinnacle of this carefully curated chaos. 500 guests filled the Winter Palace, masked and robed, dancing to music that echoed through vast halls. Behind the masks, alliances were formed, rivalries tested, and trust measured. Some whispered that the gatherings included scandalous encounters, but others insisted that it was merely a performance, a chance for Catherine to observe her court, to understand loyalties, and to assert control over Europe's curiosity. She herself laughed at the rumors, declaring simply, "I make my own morals." Diplomats were mesmerized and terrified. Count de Lure, observing from his vantage, noted how every favor, every glance, every invitation was orchestrated. It was not chaos, it was strategy. Catherine understood the power of appearances. Scandal outside the palace amplified loyalty inside. Fear, desire, and admiration became intertwined threads in the tapestry of her empire. Yet not all favored men were bound by love. Some were ambitious, seeking power and wealth. Others were loyal, seeking only to survive and thrive under her rule. Orloff, Potemkin, and the Zub brothers each knew that a misstep could be fatal. To be dismissed by the empress was to vanish from history, or worse, to be exiled, ruined, or erased from the court's memory. The stakes were impossibly high, and every man understood the price of ambition. Outside the palace, Europe gossiped with abandon. Artists painted exaggerated scenes, poets wrote cryptic verses hinting at scandal, satirists invented stories that would outlive the facts. Catherine's court became a legend before its time, a story whispered in salons and streets from London to Paris. And yet, for all the rumors, Catherine's hand remained steady. She balanced power and pleasure, desire and strategy, personal affection and political necessity with skill unmatched in European history. By the end of the decade, the world understood one truth. Catherine ruled not only by law or army, but by influence, loyalty, and desire. Every smile, every whispered word, every late-night invitation carried consequences. Her midnight gatherings, whispered across continents, had become a shield, a weapon, and a lesson. In her court, nothing was ever as it seemed. Next, we will explore how myths and reality collided in Catherine's legacy, and why the world has debated her private life for centuries. What truths survived, and which stories were invented for scandal?
The Winter Palace shimmered under countless candles, the amber glow reflecting off gold-trimmed walls and crystal chandeliers. Outside, St. Petersburg shivered under a blanket of snow, the river frozen in silent stillness. Inside, the halls were alive with whispers, laughter, and careful glances. And at the center of it all stood Catherine the Great, young, brilliant, and already a legend. Among the many men who navigated her midnight world, one name stood out above all: Grigory Orlov. He was not the tallest or the most educated, but he possessed something far more valuable: courage, loyalty, and a presence that could command attention without arrogance. Orlov had saved Catherine during the coup of 1762, standing by her side when betrayal and danger surrounded the throne. His strength and bravery had earned him not only Catherine's gratitude, but her trust. The bond between Catherine and Orlov was complex. To outsiders, it appeared to be passion and romance. To insiders, it was also strategy. Orlov's influence stretched beyond personal intimacy. Catherine entrusted him with estates, jewels, and political responsibilities that many generals and nobles would have killed for. Yet even with power in his hands, Orlov remained careful, knowing that the empress's favor could vanish as quickly as it appeared. Their days were a mixture of politics and private moments. Catherine would consult Orlov on military maneuvers, state decisions, and diplomatic strategies. At night, their conversations moved to more personal matters. But even these discussions were layered with strategy. Every compliment, every affectionate word carried meaning. Every glance and gesture measured loyalty and gauged ambition.
In Orloff, Catherine found a partner who could serve the empire and satisfy the unspoken rules of her court. But Orloff was not the only man shaping the empress's world. Grigory Potemkin soon emerged, ambitious and brilliant, with a mind as sharp as Catherine's own. Their relationship, intense and sometimes tempestuous, blended friendship, passion, and statecraft. Potemkin helped expand Russia's reach into the Black Sea, designing cities, fortresses, and military campaigns, all while deepening his personal bond with Catherine. Letters between them throbbed with emotion and strategy. "You are my friend, my knight, my sovereign." In each word lay loyalty, desire, and political calculation. The young Zubov brothers followed, cunning and charming, capturing Catherine's attention in the final years of her reign. Their rise illustrated the precariousness of life in her court. Ambition, beauty, and wit could lift a man to heights of power, but the empress's attention could shift at any moment, leaving rivals humiliated and exiled. Her court was a stage, and every man who entered it had a part to play. Some played for love, some for ambition, some for survival. All understood the stakes. Orloff, Potemkin, and the Zubov brothers navigated a world where pleasure and politics were inseparable. The empress's favor was more than personal affection. It was power, opportunity, and influence. Each man's rise or fall demonstrated a simple truth. In Catherine's court, desire was a tool, loyalty a currency, and ambition a dangerous game. Foreign ambassadors observed with fascination and horror. French envoy Baron de Breteuil wrote to Paris, "No man rises at court by merit alone. The empress's favor decides everything." Diplomats from England, Austria, and Prussia speculated endlessly. Cartoons and pamphlets exaggerated the rumors. Yet Catherine remained in control, turning gossip into a shield, a weapon, and a tool for diplomacy. Even within the palace, the rules were clear. Orloff knew that a misstep could mean disgrace. Potemkin understood that ambition alone was not enough. And the Zubov brothers realized that charm could only carry them so far. Loyalty and discretion were rewarded. Betrayal was punished. Catherine's midnight gatherings were both playground and battlefield, where fortunes were won and lost behind locked doors and candle-lit walls. In public, Catherine appeared serene, commanding, and composed, but behind the scenes, every interaction was layered with strategy. A smile could elevate a favorite to a position of power. A frown could exile him overnight. Every word, every gesture, every dance in her court carried meaning. Desire became diplomacy. Intimacy became influence. Passion became statecraft. Orloff's influence extended beyond the palace. He commanded troops, negotiated with allies, and managed estates, yet he never lost sight of the delicate balance required to remain in Catherine's favor. Potemkin's strategic brilliance reshaped entire regions, proving that love and ambition, when guided by the empress, could advance the empire. And the Zubov brothers' youthful energy demonstrated how the empress could continually refresh her inner circle, maintaining control over the shifting tides of loyalty and desire. Catherine's genius lay in understanding human nature. She knew that men craved attention, recognition, and approval. She knew that loyalty could be bought with favor and maintained through desire. And she used this understanding not for indulgence alone, but for power. Her midnight world, whispered across Europe, was as much about controlling the empire as it was about personal pleasure. Through the years, Catherine's court became a symbol of both fascination and fear. Stories traveled to London, Paris, and Vienna, mixing fact and rumor. Foreign writers speculated endlessly. Some called her scandalous, others called her brilliant, but Catherine knew the truth. Loyalty, desire, and ambition, when carefully guided, could hold an empire together more effectively than armies or laws alone. As the candles flickered in the Winter Palace, Catherine looked out over her court. Olaf stood nearby, silent, steadfast. Potemkin's eyes gleamed with ambition. The Zuboff brothers whispered to one another, eager to anticipate her next move. Each man in his way was part of her design. And Catherine, at the center of it all, understood that the delicate balance of desire and power was her greatest weapon. Next, we will see how myths and rumors collided with reality, shaping Catherine's reputation long after her death. How much of her story was truth, and how much was invented for scandal? What did history remember, and what did it forget?
The Winter Palace, once alive with laughter, music, and whispers of intrigue, had fallen silent. Candles that had burned through countless midnight feasts were now extinguished, leaving shadows that stretched across gilded halls. St. Petersburg, still blanketed by winter's chill, seemed to mourn with the city's empty streets and frozen rivers. The empress who had held the empire in her hands, who had turned her palace into a stage for desire and power, had passed away. Catherine the Great, ruler, strategist, lover, and legend, was gone. But yet her story was far from over. For centuries, rumors, gossip, and legend would fill the space left by her absence. Across Europe, writers and poets speculated wildly about the empress's private life. French novels hinted at hidden orgies, English poems wove tales of scandal, and satirical cartoons mocked her midnight feasts. Her name became synonymous with both brilliance and indulgence, creating a myth that would outlive her body by centuries. Inside the palace, her son, Paul, ascended the throne. Paul was cautious, rigid, and determined to erase the flamboyance of her mother's reign. He banished the last of her favorites, including the young and cunning Clayton Zuboff, and purged the court of anyone associated with Catherine's bold, sometimes scandalous influence. Letters were burned, portraits hidden, and whispers punished with exile. The palace, once a place of temptation and intrigue, transformed into a court of cold order and suspicion. Yet even Paul could not erase Catherine's impact. Her reforms, her policies, and her vision for Russia remained, silently shaping the empire long after her death. Schools for girls, modern hospitals, towns founded, and laws enacted were all part of her legacy. They stood as evidence that her midnight gatherings and relationships with favorites were not mere indulgence. They were woven into the very fabric of her rule. But Europe's fascination did not fade.
Writers and artists amplified tales of scandal, creating a Catherine who was at once villainous and irresistible. The infamous horse myth, grotesque and entirely false, appeared decades later, propagated by anti-Russian propagandists. Poets like Lord Byron joked, satirists in Paris invented elaborate tales, and yet travelers still sought invitations to her palace, chasing the thrill of a world that no longer existed. The empress's reputation, fueled by rumor and imagination, became legend. The truth, however, is more complex. Surviving letters and documents reveal a Catherine who was intelligent, strategic, and deliberate. Her correspondence with Grigory Orlov, Grigory Potemkin, and other favorites revealed affection, loyalty, and subtle emotional nuances, but never the wild debauchery imagined by outsiders. With Orlov, she shared gratitude and trust. With Potemkin, playful rivalry and deep political discussion. With others, mentorship and guidance. Each relationship balanced personal affection with strategic calculation, demonstrating her understanding of human nature and the delicate interplay of loyalty and desire. In the palace halls, the dynamics of power and desire had always been intertwined. Candles flickered on gilded walls, mirrors reflected the subtle movements of courtiers, and music echoed softly through corridors. Midnight gatherings were a blend of pleasure, observation, and strategy. Every glance, every compliment, every subtle gesture measured ambition and loyalty. The empress rewarded discretion and punished betrayal. To be in her favor was to have a path to power. To lose it meant exile or disgrace. These were not random acts of indulgence, they were tools of governance. The empress herself seemed amused by the stories. In letters to her friends, she wrote, "If I believed the stories, I would never sleep." Her sense of humor, combined with intelligence and foresight, allowed her to navigate the dangerous territory of rumor while maintaining control. She understood that stories could be a weapon, a shield, or a stage for her brilliance. European eyes focused on scandal. Catherine focused on loyalty, influence, and the state. Even decades after her death, historians debate where celebration ended and policy began. The empress's court was a space of paradox. Pleasure and power coexisted, often inseparably. Masked balls, candlelit dinners, and secret meetings were not merely indulgent, they were a laboratory for understanding loyalty, measuring ambition, and reinforcing influence. Orlov, Potemkin, and the Zubov brothers were not simply lovers or companions, they were instruments in Catherine's careful orchestration of statecraft. Artists captured her image surrounded by favorites, sometimes exaggerating intimacy, sometimes portraying her as serene and commanding. These images traveled across Europe, shaping perceptions and fueling the myths. To the world outside, Catherine's court seemed scandalous, decadent, and extraordinary. But in reality, it was deliberate, a complex mix of affection, calculation, and strategy. Catherine's impact extended beyond the palace walls. Her reforms transformed Russia, modernizing education, healthcare, and administration. Her relationships with favorites demonstrated how personal influence could be harnessed for political ends. Desire, loyalty, and ambition were intertwined threads in the tapestry of her reign. Her midnight gatherings, whispered across Europe, became lessons in leadership, that power could be exercised subtly through charm, intellect, and understanding human desire. Even today, Catherine's story captivates. School books hint at her secret feasts. Films and novels explore her romantic relationships. Historians continue to debate the boundary between myth and reality. But the documents she left behind, letters, decrees, and personal reflections, paint a picture of a ruler who understood the tools of power, the dangers of ambition, and the subtlety required to govern an empire. The Winter Palace may now be quiet, its candles extinguished, its corridors empty, but Catherine's presence lingers. Every rumor, every whisper, every midnight gathering lives on in memory and legend. Her court was a place of strategy and seduction, laughter and danger, loyalty and fear. She taught the world that desire could be as potent as armies, that loyalty could be shaped in private rooms, and that the mind of a ruler was a force to be reckoned with. As the empire she built continued to grow, her legend only became larger. Europe still gossiped, travelers still sought tales, and historians still debated her life. The empress who turned her palace into a bizarre orgy remains an icon of power, desire, and intelligence. Her midnight world may have ended, but the stories, myths, and lessons she left behind continue to flicker like candlelight in the corridors of history. Next, we will explore Catherine's final days, her health fading, her inner circle shrinking, and the legacy she left for Russia. What became of her favorites, and how did the empire survive the loss of the woman who had held it together through ambition, desire, and brilliance?
Winter had returned to St. Petersburg. Snow fell in thick, silent sheets over the Neva, muffling the city and turning its streets to slippery rivers of ice. Inside the Winter Palace, the vast halls that had once rung with laughter, music, and whispered intrigues seemed unusually quiet. Catherine the Great, the empress who had held the empire in her hands with brilliance, charm, and ambition, was growing weak. Her health, once as robust as her spirit, now betrayed her, and the palace seemed to sense the approaching end. The great halls, gilded and mirrored, still reflected candlelight, but fewer candles burned. Servants moved cautiously, as if fearing to disturb the fragile rhythm of the empress's last days. Courtiers whispered to one another, balancing hope, dread, and opportunism. Some watched for signs of favor, others for signs of death. The palace, always a theater of desire and power, had become a waiting room for history itself. Catherine's favorites remained close, though their numbers had dwindled. Clayton Zuboff, now one of the last remaining companions of her inner circle, stayed near her side, eager to maintain influence even as her health faded. Yet he understood the delicate balance of loyalty and survival. In Catherine's court, proximity to the empress was always a privilege and a risk. Now, as the end approached, that privilege became precarious. Even in her weakened state, Catherine's mind remained sharp. She continued to receive reports, review plans, and consider reforms. Her empire, stretched across vast lands from the Baltic to the Black Sea, depended on her decisions. Though her body was failing, her intellect remained formidable, and those closest to her knew that she was still in command of the empire. Every glance, every gesture, every word still carried authority. Her inner circle gathered quietly, aware that time was slipping away. Orlov, long loyal, watched over the palace with the vigilance of a general and the tenderness of a companion. Potemkin,
though no longer at her side as in earlier years, sent messages of admiration and respect, honoring the bond they had shared. Even the younger courtiers, ambitious and eager, recognized the end of an era and the shifting of power to her son, Paul I. Letters from Catherine's past lay scattered across her chambers, reminders of the empire she had shaped and the men who had shared her journey. Each letter told a story of ambition, desire, loyalty, and strategy. Some were passionate, others strategic, but all reflected the careful orchestration that had defined her reign. Her court had been a place of midnight feasts, whispered secrets, and intricate games, but now it was a space of reflection, memory, and the quiet reckoning of history. Even as her body weakened, Catherine maintained a sense of humor and control. She joked softly with attendants, reminded servants of past instructions, and commented wryly on the rumors that had followed her for decades. "If they believe the stories," she said once, "they must think I never slept." Her wit, combined with a mind still alive with strategy, kept the palace alert. Every movement, every word remained deliberate, a testament to a life lived with intelligence and purpose. Outside the palace, St. Petersburg waited. The city, built on mud and dreams, seemed to hold its breath. Europe, still fascinated by Catherine's court, continued to speculate. Rumors of her midnight feasts, her favorites, and her daring private life traveled across borders. Yet within the palace, the focus had shifted from scandal to legacy. What would she leave behind? How would the empire endure without her guiding hand? Catherine's final days were marked by careful preparation. She summoned her closest advisors, arranged her affairs, and ensured that the empire's administration would continue smoothly under her son. She gave instructions for her favorites, balancing generosity with caution. Estates, titles, and pensions were assigned, ensuring loyalty even as her presence faded. Every decision reflected her understanding that power was as fragile as it was potent. On a cold winter morning, Catherine's health took a turn for the worse. Courtiers gathered at the palace, some weeping silently, others stoically accepting the inevitable. Her favorites, loyal to the end, remained by her side. Orlov offered comfort. Zubov watched anxiously, and those who had survived decades of court intrigue now faced a world without her guiding hand. Her final hours were quiet, yet dignified. She reflected on the empire she had built, the reforms she had enacted, and the men who had shaped her life and rule. The Winter Palace, which had witnessed countless schemes, romances, and midnight decisions, now bore witness to the close of an era. Catherine the Great, empress, strategist, lover, and visionary, passed quietly, leaving behind a world forever changed by her intellect, ambition, and daring. With her death, the empire faced a reckoning. Paul I ascended the throne, immediately purging the court of her influence. The last of her favorites, including Clayton Zubov, were exiled or removed from positions of power. Letters and portraits were hidden or destroyed. The palace, once alive with music, intrigue, and desire, became a place of order and suspicion. Yet Catherine's reforms, vision, and legacy endured, shaping Russia for generations. Europe continued to gossip. Artists painted imagined scenes of her life, writers invented new stories, and rumors flourished in salons across the continent. The empress, who turned her palace into a bizarre orgy, remained a figure of fascination. Some celebrated her freedom, others warned of excess, but all recognized the power she wielded. Her midnight world, though silent now, had reshaped an empire and left a legacy that no edict or rumor could erase. Next, we will explore how her reforms, cultural contributions, and legend continued to influence Russia and the world long after her death. What remained of her midnight world, and how is she remembered today?
The Winter Palace, though quiet after Catherine's death, remained a monument to her reign. Its gilded walls, grand halls, and vast corridors held memories of laughter, whispered secrets, midnight gatherings, and the careful orchestration of power. Even in silence, the palace seemed alive, echoing the presence of the empress who had once held the empire in her hands. Catherine the Great's death in 1796 marked the end of an era, yet it was also the beginning of a legend that would outlive her by centuries. Her reforms, her vision, and the complex web of relationships she had nurtured continued to influence Russia and the world. She had not ruled through fear alone, nor through brute force. She had ruled through intelligence, charm, strategy, and above all, understanding the human heart. Her reforms were monumental: schools for girls, hospitals, new towns, legal reforms, and administrative improvements transformed the empire. Catherine understood that a strong Russia required not only military power, but educated citizens, functioning institutions, and a vibrant culture. She commissioned architects, artists, and writers, blending European Enlightenment ideals with Russian tradition. Her midnight world of desire and strategy was just one layer of a ruler who saw the empire as both a political and cultural project. Yet it was her personal influence through favorites like Orlov, Potemkin, and Zubov that demonstrated her understanding of loyalty and human nature. These men were instruments of power as much as companions of affection. Orlov's courage, Potemkin's brilliance, and Zubov's charm all reflected her ability to harness desire, ambition, and intelligence to consolidate control over an empire. She knew that the personal and political could intertwine, and she wielded that truth with unmatched skill. Europe continued to be fascinated. Poets, novelists, and artists created works inspired by her life, sometimes blending fact and fiction. French pamphlets, English cartoons, and German gossip painted her as a figure of scandal, while other writers admired her intellect and political genius. Even centuries later, debates continued. Was she a scandalous woman, a brilliant strategist, or both? The answer, like Catherine herself, was never simple. Her palace gatherings, once whispered about as orgies or secret feasts, were in truth complex instruments of governance. Masks, music, dances, and private dinners were more than indulgence. They were tests of loyalty, measures of ambition, and demonstrations of influence. Every gesture mattered, every glance communicated a message. Through these orchestrations, Catherine taught the world that power could be exercised subtly, using desire and charm as tools as potent as armies and laws. The legend of Catherine persisted because of the interplay between myth and reality. The empress herself seemed to anticipate it, joking about rumors and exaggerations. She understood that stories could shape perception, influence allies,
and intimidate rivals. Her ability to navigate the world of gossip while maintaining authority became one of her greatest achievements. She had transformed personal pleasure into political strength, and in doing so, created a legend that outlasted even her empire. Her favorites, too, became part of history. Orlov, Potemkin, and Zubov's names are remembered not merely for their relationships with the empress, but for their roles in shaping Russia. Orlov's military actions, Potemkin's urban and territorial developments, and Zubov's courtly maneuvering illustrate how Catherine's influence extended far beyond the palace walls. The midnight games, the whispered secrets, and the candlelit conversations were all part of a larger strategy to bind loyalty and cultivate power. Even in death, Catherine's presence lingered. Portraits of her surrounded by favorites, paintings of her court, and stories passed down through generations ensured that her shadow remained long over Russian history. The Winter Palace became more than a building. It became a symbol of ambition, intelligence, and the complicated interplay of desire and governance. Travelers from across Europe came seeking to glimpse her world, to witness the empire she had shaped, even if only through the ghost of memory. Catherine's legacy was also cultural. She invited thinkers, writers, and scientists to her court, establishing Russia as a center of enlightenment. Her correspondence with Voltaire, Diderot, and other European intellectuals showcased a mind unafraid of ideas, debate, and innovation. While Europe focused on rumors of her private life, Catherine quietly built schools, libraries, theaters, and hospitals, leaving behind tangible proof of a ruler whose ambition extended far beyond the bedroom or the ballroom. Her ability to blend personal charm with political strategy is perhaps her most enduring lesson. In a world where loyalty was fragile and ambition deadly, Catherine demonstrated that influence could be cultivated through understanding human desire. She turned relationships into instruments of statecraft, pleasure into a tool of diplomacy, and intimacy into a path for securing power. In her hands, the private became political and the personal became national. Even now, historians debate where truth ends and legend begins. Tales of her midnight gatherings, her lovers, and her bold decisions circulate alongside letters, decrees, and architectural achievements. The palace walls remember the laughter, the whispered promises, and the careful orchestration of influence. Catherine's story is a reminder that history is rarely simple. Power, desire, ambition, and intelligence are threads that, when woven together, create both legend and legacy. As the candlelight flickers in memory of the Winter Palace, one truth remains clear. Catherine the Great was a ruler who understood the delicate balance of the human heart and the demands of an empire. Her midnight gatherings may have faded into rumor, but her influence endured. Russia became stronger, richer, and more enlightened. Her favorites, her reforms, her cultural projects, and her brilliant orchestration of power ensured that her name would be remembered for centuries. The empress who turned her palace into a bizarre orgy remains a figure of fascination, mystery, and admiration. Her midnight world may have ended, but the stories, myths, and lessons she left behind continued to flicker like candlelight in the corridors of history. And so, Catherine's legacy endures, not only as scandal or legend, but as a testament to the intelligence, ambition, and courage of a woman who reshaped an empire and rewrote the rules of power.
The Winter Palace stands, silent but alive, a reminder that history remembers more than events. It remembers vision, daring, and the audacity to govern both hearts and nations. Catherine's candlelight, once so alive with intrigue, laughter, and desire, may have dimmed, but it will never be extinguished.